The darkness does not begin with the first lash, or the first chain, or the iron-fanged grin of an overseer lit by rust-red lumen stripes. It begins in silence, in the moment after the last shot has been fired, and the last war cry dies in a defeated throat. The orc hates silence. It starves on it. An orc without sound is an orc without a fight, and that is the first cruelty of Imperial captivity. Not agony, but the removal of noise itself. Somewhere deep under a decrepit manufactorum, past layers of ash-blackened steel and ventilation ducts that breathe like diseased lungs, the prisoners are kept in serried, stinking rows. Green flesh slick with sweat, shackles that never stop humming, the taste of promethium soot hanging in every breath. Some of them still dream of open sky, of roaring engines, of the rapturous thunder of battle. Others remember nothing at all, their minds eroded by sedatives, shock mauls, and the monotonous grind of servitor labour. The Imperium does not take orc prisoners because it is merciful. It takes them because even a snarling beast can be forced into purpose. If you can hear this story, then fate or the Emperor's inscrutable will has brought you here. Stay a while. Let the vox runic of history carve itself into the metal of your memory. And if these words stir something in you, if the shadows of this tale grip you with cold iron fingers, then share it, so more may witness the depths of this forgotten cruelty. Lend your support to the channel that preserves these stories in the only way the Imperium respects. With numbers, with reach, with voices raised against the impossible. Subscribe, so the archive endures. This is not a tale told from a command throne or a tactical display. It is a descent into the bowels of Imperial industry, where the green-skinned prisoners are broken, shaved, scarred, and hollowed out into something that barely remembers war. The story coils through shadowed corridors and dead halls, each chapter sinking deeper until the light from above becomes myth and the machinery below becomes God. 7 movements, each darker than the last, until we reach that final chamber where rumour, heresy, and truth may be indistinguishable in the stink of oil and blood. They said the war was over long before the last shell fell, but the orcs never believed such things. Even when the battlefield lay drowned in blackened mud and the sky was nothing but a smear of smoke, they still waited for the next roar, the next charge, the next promise of death and triumph and speed. To an orc, the world only made sense when it was breaking. Yet here, in the hollow dawn after the guns stopped firing, something worse settled across the churned earth and shattered trenches. It was not surrender. It was not fear. It was silence. The sudden absence of thunder rolled across the cratered ground like a tidal wave, leaving every wounded orc blinking in bewildered rage, clutching broken choppers and useless sluggers, trying to make sense of a world that had simply fallen quiet. They didn't fall in battle. They were smothered, outflanked by armoured columns that crawled from the horizon with the inevitability of steel avalanches. The Astra Militarum swept across the field with surgeon's precision. Baneblades rumbled forward, commissars shouting commands into the smoke, Lascannon beams slicing through warbikes like butcher's knives through wet flesh. The air stank of promethium and burning oil. Orc trucks exploded in bright, ugly bursts of fire. Big mechs screeched and spat curses as their contraptions were dismantled by artillery. Yet even as war bosses bellowed orders and knobs swung massive choppers, the green tide had faltered. Ammunition ran dry. Engines died. Weird boys screamed as their minds ruptured. The wire drained from the air like steam from a cracked pipe. By nightfall, the survivors were little more than animals snapping at bayonets and tank treads. They fought until their limbs broke and their teeth cracked, until shock mauls hammered them into drooling, unconscious heaps. The Imperium does not take prisoners out of mercy. The Imperium takes prisoners because even a monster can be made to work. By the time the orcs awoke, the front line was gone. They had been hauled from the mud, stripped of armour, shackled at the wrists and ankles, bound in rust-red chains stamped with the sigils of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Their tusks were cracked. Their hides had been sponged with sterilizer, leaving skin raw and stinging beneath the clamps of iron restraints. They were dragged onto rattling flatbed carriers guarded by Skitari, whose photonic oculars cast narrow beams of red light across every twitching limb. None of the prisoners knew how long the journey took. For orcs, time was only measured in battle, and there was no battle here. The transports plunged deeper into some distant manufactorum complex, where stone gave way to steel, where the ground vibrated constantly from the grind of machinery far below. The tunnels swallowed them. Ceiling lights flickered like dying stars. Flayed banners of the Imperial Aquila hung in filth-caked rows. The deeper they were taken, the less the air tasted of smoke and dirt, and the more it reeked of chemical sterility, harsh astringents, coolant oil, the acrid sting of recycled oxygen. The clang of armoured boots on metal decking echoed down the corridors, and every time one orc snarled or shifted, a Skitarii warden levelled its galvanic rifle and let loose a crackling warning burst of electricity that left the prisoner convulsing. Eventually, the transport rails ended at a massive vault door sealed with cogwork sigils and chains of blackened adamant. The tech priest, who operated the controls, was little more than a skeleton draped in cables and robes. Its fingers were metal claws that danced across activation runes, and each movement sent machine prayers humming into the stale air. The locks disengaged with a grinding roar, and when the door peeled open on piston-driven hinges, the darkness beyond breathed like a living thing. Inside was a cavern of rusted iron. Low ceilings, dripping pipes, rows of cages bolted to the floor. A sub-level holding facility, abandoned during some forgotten century, resurrected now to serve a new purpose. The guards shoved the orcs forward, clubs striking backs and calves until green bodies stumbled into their metal coffins. Doors slammed shut. Locks clicked. Hydraulic clamps hissed. A final round of shock prods quieted the last growls. At first, the orcs howled. They spat curses, beat their fists against the bars, slammed shoulders into steel until bone chipped and skin tore. Noise echoed through the sub-level like the thrashing of wild beasts. But the walls were thick, the ceiling low. The chambers tight enough to swallow every riotous sound. There were no towering war drums here. No engines roaring, no bullets cracking through the air. Just the distant thrum of ventilators and the gentle drip of condensation sliding down pipes. Hours passed. Maybe days, the prisoners did not know. Lumen strips along the ceiling flickered with an inconsistent, faint amber glow, just bright enough to cast shadows that danced like mocking spirits. Orcs were creatures built on motion, on battle, on frenzy, and here they had nothing. No enemy, no target, no reason to roar. The strongest of them raged until their throats tore and blood seeped down their chins. Others tried to sleep, only to jolt awake from the twitching of muscles that begged to swing axes or fire guns. In the void of silence, their minds turned inward, and there was nothing for them to feast on but their own confusion. The Imperium understood what it was doing. Silence was a weapon. After the third cycle of artificial night, the facility awoke with mechanical precision. Lumen strips crackled with white glare. Sirens wailed. The prison block trembled as steel gates clanged open and the cages slid along floor rails, each one pulled by chains to a processing bay deeper underground. The orcs' cages rattled across armoured decking that vibrated with the heartbeat of the ancient factory. No one spoke. Orcs bared their teeth, but the muzzles locked around their jaws held them in place. Every sound they tried to make was muffled into pathetic growls. When the cages stopped, they sat beneath a viewing gantry wrapped in rust and dangling cables. A cluster of tech priests loomed above, whispering Binharic chants that stuttered like corrupted data. Servitors descended, massive, brutish things of metal and flesh fused without mercy. The orcs were dragged from their cages one by one, shackled to iron pillars, and examined under lumens bright enough to bleach their vision white. Robotic arms probed their skin, scanned their bones, and injected syringes of thick sedative into bulging veins. Some of the prisoners tried to resist, but every struggle was answered with a shock maul driven into ribs or skulls until they collapsed in groaning heaps. The drug was cold, a creeping frost beneath the skin that dulled rage, blurred thought, and softened muscle. When the evaluations were finished, the orcs were returned to their cages and pushed down another tunnel. This one descended so steeply the air grew heavy and warm, pulsing with the smothered breath of machines. Metal gave way to stone for a short while, jagged rock-shot walls trailing condensation like tears. The cages rattled along tracks that spiraled down until the temperature changed again, no longer warm, but cold, sterile, aching with the scent of chemicals and disinfectant. Sublevel 9. The cages halted in a square chamber with grated floors and looming lamps that burned with a sickly yellow glow. The walls were lined with racks of surgical instruments, bone saws, injector rigs, chromium hooks, and pipes that exhaled bursts of white steam. The air crackled with static. Data conduits pulsed with shifting runes. Every device hummed with the sacred machine spirit's dispassionate hunger, eager to transform flesh into purpose. A tech priest Magos descended from the gantry, robes whispering like dry skin. What remained of its face was held together by metal staples. 3 mechadendrites coiled from its spine, each tipped with a different surgical tool. Its voice rasped through a vox grill, distorted and heavy with ritual incantation. The words were not for the orcs, they were for the machines. The first orc was hauled from his cage and slammed onto a metal table, shackles clamping his wrists and ankles. He thrashed with what strength he had, but the sedative slowed his movements. The Magos signaled to its attendants, and the procedure began. The orc's green skin, thick and fungal, was stripped with chemical scrapers that hissed as they burned. Whole layers peeled away like scorched hide, revealing pale, raw flesh beneath. The orc roared against his muzzle, but the corridors swallowed the sound. Another injection stabbed into his neck, pumping more suppressants into his blood. When the saws came out, even his muffled cries faded. In cage after cage, the process repeated. Orcs were dragged out, lashed down, and flayed of everything that made them resilient. Fungal dermis was cauterized, pores were irradiated, muscle fibers were laced with inhibitor implants that disrupted the regenerative traits bred into their brutal biology. The Imperium feared many things, but the orcs' ability to multiply, in shadow, was near the top of every tech priest's list of heresies. To keep prisoners, the biology had to be broken. The pain was not what broke them. Orcs are born in war, molded by it, cherished by it. Pain was a friend they met every morning. But the silence was different. There was no screaming mob of comrades, no Gretchen fleeing in circles, no mech boys shouting obscenities as sparks flew. There was only the rasping breath of each prisoner as they were stripped and processed, and the cold mechanical murmurs of the tech priests. Pain without noise was not pain they understood. It was hollow. It was pointless. It was terrifying. One orc, the largest of them, thick-headed, broad-shouldered, with a jagged scar across his lip, fought longer than the others. He lunged even as the clamps closed on his wrists. He bucked against the sedatives, eyes blazing with raw hatred. Tech priests circled him like vultures, spraying him with sedative foam and driving a dozen injector needles into his chest. But still he strained. Even with blood pouring from torn wrists, even with his skin blistered from chemical burns, he tried to stand. It took 3 Skitari, 2 servitors, and a Dunastrider with shock lances to finally pin him down. As the last glimmer of his mind faded into drugged haze, his gaze locked onto the Magos, and though his mouth was clamped shut, his eyes screamed a promise. This was not the end. The tech priests did not care. Orcs were not enemies to them. They were raw material. Once processed, the prisoners were herded through a narrow corridor where vents pumped frigid air across their exposed flesh. They shivered in chains, muscles spasming from injections and shock treatment. Blood dripped from open wounds, staining the metal floor in splashes of deep crimson that steamed in the cold. Servitors dragged them into a freight elevator that groaned downward through the heart of the manufactorum, deeper than the orcs had believed possible. The descent was slow. The air vibrated with a low, rhythmic thrum, as if the entire substructure were a giant organ, dragging in poisoned breath. Fungi scraped skin reddened, eyes watered. The stink of coolant and machine oil drowned out everything else. One by one, the orcs slumped against their restraints, their bodies too heavy with drugs to resist. When the elevator finally halted, the doors slid open with a hydraulic hiss. Before them stretched a cavernous labor pit, lit by lumen strips arranged in endless rows across a vaulted ceiling. Steam rose in thick pillars. Chains hung from motorized winches. Hundreds of other orcs, those captured on earlier campaigns, labored in the dark, their bodies hunched, their eyes glassy, their skin pale where it had once been deep green. They hauled slag in overflowing carts. They dragged massive cables toward humming generators. They turned millstones that powered ancient coolant pumps. Every breath came in ragged gasps. Every step echoed with the sound of metal scraping metal. The new prisoners were shoved into line. Controlled bursts from galvanic rifles made them shuffle forward, chains rattling. A servitor slammed iron collars around their necks, each one tagged with a bar of flashing runes that monitored heartbeat, movement, and aggression levels. There was no speech here, only the metallic rasp of exhausted bodies fighting to remain upright. The silence gnawed at them. No wah, no engines, no shouting, just machines, endlessly grinding. It was then the orcs began to understand. They were not prisoners, they were tools. Days bled into weeks. The sedatives ensured they felt little clarity, just a constant heavy fog. Their muscles, though brutal and powerful, were drained by endless labor. Their regenerative biology, once unstoppable, was crippled by the chemical scars that laced their skin. No spores formed, no fungal sweat, no skin repairs. Just raw wounds that scabbed and reopened, until their bodies were riddled with scar tissue. The largest orc, the one who had fought the longest, began to falter. His breathing was ragged. His hands quivered on the iron cart he was forced to push. Each step sent jolts of pain up his spine. He had forgotten his war boss's name, forgotten the battlefield, forgotten the roar of his shooter. His memories dissolved in the chemical haze. He knew only the chain at his neck and the cart beneath his hands. One night, if it could be called night, for underground time was meaningless. The facility fell darker than usual. The lumen strips flickered. Machinery groaned. Something in the depths of the manufactorum wailed like a dying reactor. The orcs froze, even drugged, even broken. Their instincts flared. Somewhere above, a tremor shook dust from the ceiling. The chains hanging from the rafters rattled. For a heartbeat, a faint echo pulsed through the air, something that sounded like a distant gunshot. The orcs looked up. Their eyes widened. Something ancient stirred in their veins. But as quickly as the tremor came, it vanished. Tech priests rushed along the gantries, typing Binharic commands into data slates. Lumen strips brightened, alarms silenced, and the moment of instinct passed like smoke on cold air. The servitors marched down the line, injecting fresh sedatives, and the orcs sank back into stupor. Silence returned. The machines resumed their endless grind. The overseers spoke in voices devoid of passion, and the prisoners continued to drag their chains along the factory floor, step after agonizing step, never understanding why their hearts pounded at echoes of something they could no longer remember. War. As weeks turned into months, the facility changed them. Their muscles shrank. Their eyes dulled. Their teeth loosened. Those who collapsed were revived by brutal injections that forced their hearts to keep beating, their lungs to keep drawing breath. Death would have been mercy, and the Imperium did not deal in mercy. Some, hollowed of all identity, shuffled like animate corpses. Others twitched in their sleep, as though punch-drunk ghosts of long-lost battles still haunted the last working synapses of their minds. Yet despite it all, part of the orcs refused to die. In the corners of the labour pit, behind carts and slag piles, they sometimes shivered with phantom muscle memory, a hand clenching, a jaw grinding, an eye narrowing at unseen prey. The smallest hints of what they once were flickered like embers under ash. It was not rebellion, not yet. Just instinct, trapped beneath layers of drugs and silence. The largest of them, scarred and broken, began to dream. Not in words, but in sound. The distant rumble of engines, the thunder of boots, the crack of gunfire, the deep, roaring laughter of a war boss whose name he could no longer reach. When he awoke, his heart pounded against his ribs and his hands throbbed with an urge to fight. The sedatives tried to drown it. The silence tried to bury it. But something remained. The Orks did not know it yet. But silence is not a weapon the Imperium can wield forever. Even steel grows tired. Even chains wear thin. Even the quietest chamber can echo if something deep enough starts to stir. And far below sub-level 9, older than the prisoners, older than the machinery, older than the tech priests who mastered this tomb of labor, the manufactorum walls trembled again. Just once. Just faintly. So faintly that no human ear heard it. But the Orks did. Something had shifted. Something had changed. And silence, at long last, began to break. If the labor pits were meant to break the Orks' strength, then sub-level 9 was built to erase their nature entirely. The facility devoured nights and days until both lost meaning. Time became a grey metallic blur of pain, exhaustion, and chemical numbness. None of the prisoners spoke. Not because they had nothing to say, but because the muzzles locked around their jaws made even groaning a suffocating effort. The silence was total. It pressed down like a weight heavier than any chain, until even thought became quiet. But the Imperium does nothing without purpose. Every rivet in the walls, every servo skull drifting through the tunnels, every syringe of amber sedative dripping through a needle of hypodermic steel, all of it fed into one process, one machine, one end. After grinding for weeks in the labor pits, the first group of prisoners was marched back to the scraping bays. The tech priests spoke in clipped Binharic, and servitors herded the Orks with iron prods that snapped arcs of blue electricity across bare flesh. The largest of the prisoners staggered beneath the weight of his chains, his breath a rasping growl in the muzzle. He had long ago forgotten his own name, but some part of him still remembered that he used to have one. That sliver of memory was an ember buried deep under ash, stubbornly refusing to die. The corridor that led to the scraper bays was narrow and low-ceilinged, forcing the Orks to stoop as they walked. Pipes ran along the walls, sweating condensation and venting hissing clouds of oily vapor. Every 5 meters, a servo skull hovered in a recessed alcove, its lenses tracking the prisoners, recording pulse rhythms, monitoring for aggression spikes. Data scrollers flickered with runes that translated the readings into the sacred language of the machine god. The air grew colder. The scent of industrial coolant thickened. When the prisoners emerged from the corridor, the scraper bays opened before them. Vast chambers carved into the bedrock, lined with metal racks and surgical platforms. Rows of iron tables stretched across the floor, each fitted with restraints and mechanical arms adorned with scraping knives, acid sprayers, and cauterizing irons. Overhead, massive extractor fans churned sluggishly, fighting to pull fumes from the air. They failed. The room stank of burned flesh, antiseptic, and despair. The tech priests moved like robed spectres, metal feet clanking on grated steel. They did not look at the Orks as living beings, but as specimens, materials, problems to be solved. At the far end of the bay, a towering Magos biologist directed the operation. Tubes fed into its spine. Lenses protruded from its shaven skull. Every gesture of its mechadendrites sent servo skulls diving and servitors lumbering. The Orks were lined up, shackles bolted to mooring hooks in the floor. The Magos initiated the ritual, a grinding cascade of Binharic tones that echoed like the whine of malfunctioning Vox speakers. The machine spirits answered. The scraping rigs came alive with shrill motors, and the high-pitched whine of monoblades vibrating with lethal precision. The Orks pulled against their chains, snarling through their restraints, eyes rolling with instinctive fury. But fury meant nothing here. The first Ork was dragged to the nearest table. Even weakened by months of toil and sedation, his body was thick with corded muscle. But as they pinned him down, his strength crumbled under shock-lash strikes. His wrists locked in place, his ankles bolted to the table, a gag of iron forced into his mouth, crushing his tusks against his jaw. He still tried to bite, still tried to roar. The scraping began. A chemical wash was sprayed across his skin, hissing and bubbling as it ate through the upper layer of green dermis. The smell filled the chamber, sour and acidic. The orc's muffled scream shivered the air. Then the monoblades came down, their edges vibrating at frequencies designed to sever fungal flesh without dulling. Long strips of green hide peeled away. Blood welled and ran down the table, pooling beneath it. The prisoners watched, their chests heaving, as the tech priests harvested everything that made them orc. Regenerative tissues, spore-rich layers, fungal glands. Servitors dumped the harvested tissue into vats of viscous preservative fluid, where it dissolved into cloudy pulp. The tech priests studied the results, recording readouts on data slates, analyzing for weaknesses. Humanity's war is eternal. The Mechanicus never rests. The orcs did not understand these rituals, but they felt the violation. An orc's skin is not just armor, it is identity. It is the proof of war, of endurance, of rising from wounds that would kill any human. To strip it away was to erase who they had been. The prisoners watched as more of their kin were dragged forward. Some thrashed until bones snapped. Some tried to bite through their muzzles. Some shivered with numb resignation, drugged beyond resistance. The largest of them, the one who had resisted longest, was forced onto a table near the center of the chamber. Even sedated, his size was immense. Veins like cables ran beneath his bruised flesh. As the clamps closed over him, instinct overcame numbness. His muscles bunched. With a roar strangled by the muzzle, he ripped one arm free, metal bent. Bolts sheared. A servitor lunged, but he seized the metal skull in his palm and crushed it with a sound like cracking bone. Sparks spat from the servitor's ruined brain. The tech priest reacted instantly. Shock lances crackled. A volley of galvanic rounds tore into his chest, each shot punching through muscle. He staggered, bellowing. The second servitor rammed a syringe the size of a dagger into his neck. Sedative flooded his bloodstream. His vision blurred. His limbs trembled. Even his rage, vast and primal, was dragged under by the chemical tide. When he collapsed, the tech priest secured him with triple-strength restraints. The Magos lifted a mechanical claw and examined him with cold curiosity. Here was a specimen with unusual resistance. Here was a creature whose biology fought chemical suppression with surprising intensity. The Magos signaled for deeper invasive measures. The scraping began, and even unconscious, the orc's body tried to resist. Muscles spasmed, fingers curled. To the humans, he was just more raw matter. But to the prisoners watching, he was something else. He was the last flicker of what they used to be. Hours dragged on. The scraper bays were filled with the soft drone of monoblades and the hiss of cauterizing wands. The orcs were reduced to shivering, blood-slick forms, wrapped in patches of crimson gauze and electrostatic bandages designed to prevent spore contamination. When the tech priests finished, the prisoners were dragged off the tables, barely conscious. The metal floor was littered with strips of green hide, like fallen banners of a defeated army. As the orcs were herded toward the reconditioning corridors, something stirred at the edge of perception. The machinery in the walls hummed differently, as though the gears were adjusting their rhythm. The lumen strips flickered. A faint tremor rattled the surgical instruments. The Magos turned one mechanical eye toward the ceiling, calculating. The tremor was small, insignificant, probably a pressure shift in the coolant vents. Nothing more, but the orcs felt it again. A pulse, deep beneath the floor. A thud like a giant's heartbeat, faint and distant. Their eyes widened. Their breath quickened. It was not sound, not truly. It was memory. It was war stirring in their blood. The tech priests ignored it. They believed they had already broken the captives. They believed the silence had done its work. And for a while, it seemed they were right. The orcs were marched back to the labor pits. Their bodies shook with fever. Their skin, raw and pale like meat left too long in cold air, was wrapped in patches of synthetic dermis that barely held their wounds together. Yet the overseers did not relent. They loaded the prisoners with more chains, more carts, more weight. Servitors prodded with shock staves. Skitari monitored heart rhythms and hormone levels. Every test confirmed what the Imperium believed. The green resilience had been cut out, surgically erased. No growth, no regeneration. No spore curdling beneath the skin. But the Imperium does not understand orcs, not fully, not ever. The fungal cells in orc bodies are stubborn, ancient, and almost gleefully disobedient. Even as the chemicals burned through their veins, Some of the deeper tissues twisted and endured. The regenerative organ clusters, small as grains of sand, hid in bone marrow, dormant and waiting. When the greatest of them was scraped, his muscles tore and his blood spilled, but something within him clenched like a fist, refusing final surrender. Slow at first, microscopic, but real. In the massive labor pit, the days grew stranger. The prisoners dragged themselves through the motions of labor, but every so often, one would twitch. A tremor in the arm, a sudden tightening of the jaw, a spark of something animal. Overseers increased the sedative intake. They ordered servitors to chain the prisoners tighter, but the tremors did not stop. One night, if one could call it a night, the labor pit was plunged into darkness. All lumen strips shut off at once. The machines went silent. The sudden absence of mechanical roar was like the breath before a scream. For a single heartbeat, the sub-level existed in pure blackness. The prisoners froze. Then the emergency lights flickered on, washed in red. Tech priests shouted Binhoric instructions. Servo skulls swarmed. Something had gone wrong in the power conduits. The Magos ordered a full diagnostic. Servitors marched into maintenance corridors. And in the shadows, the Orks stirred. Without light, without machines drowning their senses, they heard something they had not heard in months. The pounding of their own hearts, the rush of blood, the animal roar of survival. The largest of them, still weak, still trembling from the scraping, lifted his head. His breath fogged in the air. His fingers curled. His muscles swelled. His restraints groaned. He remembered something, not a name, not a place, not even a face. He remembered violence. The emergency lights snapped back to white. The machines roared. Overseers resumed their patrol. But a line had been crossed. Silence was no longer complete. The prisoners had heard themselves breathe. For Orks, breath is life, and life demands action. The tech priests noticed slight increases in neural activity and muscle response. They adjusted the sedative doses. They tightened restraints. They increased shock treatment cycles. But still, the prisoners twitched and stirred. At first, it was nothing, just small movements. But the Skitari, whose minds were linked to tactical readouts at all times, began to detect micro-patterns. Muscle contractions matching tension rhythms, heartbeats aligning in low thudding pulses. It was almost musical, like the earliest stirrings of a war chant without sound. The Magos responded with ruthless efficiency. New procedures, new chemicals, new scraping techniques. The prisoners were marched back to the scraper bays. More skin was removed. More sedatives pumped in, bolts driven deeper into their spines. Some Orks collapsed and never rose. Their bodies were dragged away by servitors, destined for incineration. But the largest of them did not die. He convulsed beneath the blades, but his heart refused to stop. He bled, but his blood thickened. He should have been reduced to a husk. Instead, a strange fever overtook him. His veins pulsed with sluggish, unnatural strength. The tech priests took note. Their mechanized voices chattered. Something in his biology had resisted purification, something buried deep, beyond chemical reach. The Magos ordered a biopsy of his marrow. Servo skulls drilled into bone, extracting samples. But even as they worked, his body knitted tiny wounds closed. Slowly, imperceptibly, but undeniably. The Imperium believed it had broken him. It had only made him dangerous. The next time the prisoners were marched to the bays, they shuffled slower. The scraping had made their bodies fragile, but it had also pushed them past the edge of agony into a realm of numb hatred. Every step was agony, but hatred supported them. Hatred for silence, for machines, for shackles, for the void where battle used to live. On the 10th scraping cycle, something unexpected occurred. The largest Ork, barely conscious, lifted his head. His eyes locked on the Magos. And for the first time since captivity began, a sound escaped him. A deep, guttural vibration that was not quite a growl, not quite a word. The sound rattled through the chamber like a storm brewing in the dark. The tech priests froze. The vibration spread. The Orks around him stirred. Chests heaved. Throats strained. Muzzles muffled the sounds, but the vibration resonated. The weakest prisoners began to tremble. The stronger ones leaned forward, pulling against chains. It was not organized, not conscious. It was instinct. Something ancient and violent had awakened. The Magos snarled machine curse and ordered full sedation. Shock lances fired. Galvanic rifles crackled, searingers drove into flesh. But the sound did not stop. It grew louder. Deep, rumbling pulses rolled through the chamber like a primitive drumbeat. The Orks could not speak, but they could remember. The overseers panicked. Servitors malfunctioned, pushing restraints tighter than intended. Bones cracked. Chains groaned. But still, the prisoners made that low, thunderous hum. It was not rebellion. Not yet. It was a heartbeat. The tech priests drowned the chamber in sedative gas. One by one, the Orks fell unconscious. The sound faded. The machines regained control. But the Magos was uneasy. He ordered additional chemical cocktails injected into every prisoner. He ordered psychic dampeners installed in the walls. He ordered the Orks separated, isolated, kept from synchronizing. But fear is inefficiency, and inefficiency is heresy. The Mechanicus does not fear. It calculates, and the calculations showed the prisoners were contained, broken, silenced. For a while, they were right. The Orks returned to labor. The scrapers harvested more tissue. The overseers tightened restraints. Weeks of sedation passed. The prisoners' eyes dulled again. But in the deepest cells of their bodies, old secrets stirred. Ork biology, stubborn as a dying sun, recovered microscopic strength. Fungal nodes regrew. Muscles thickened by fractions of a millimeter. Scar tissue hardened like armor. The largest of them healed sleep by sleep, wound by wound. His skin, though pale from the chemical flaying, darkened at the edges. His blood thickened with spores the tech priests thought destroyed. He was not healing fast. He was healing right, and every day, the machines trembled just a little louder. One cycle, the chains that dragged Ork hearts snapped in a blinding shower of sparks. A servitor detected tension beyond safe parameters, but too late. The cart rolled free and smashed into a generator housing. Flames erupted, sprinklers doused the air, and alarms rang. The Orks watched the chains swing with unnatural weight, the snapped links clattering like broken teeth. No one spoke. No one moved, but every prisoner felt something shift inside. Another cycle. 2 prisoners collapsed beside each other. Servitors shoved needles between their ribs to restart their hearts. But the chemical jolt triggered spasms too strong, and both Orks thrashed violently, tearing cables from a junction box. The lights flickered, electricity arced. The pain was horrific, but in that pain, the Orks remembered what rage felt like. Slowly, silently, they were becoming Orks again. Even the tech priests sensed it. They increased suppression protocols. They repeated scraping cycles. They removed more tissue, more spores, more regenerative clusters. But no matter how deep they carved, the Orks endured. Something in their biology fought with primal determination. And then came the night of the third blackout. The lumen strips failed. The machines went quiet. There was no noise, no light, no chemical stench, just blackness. The Orks stood in silence. No restraints pulled them down. No overseers barked orders. No servitors stomped toward them. Only darkness. And in darkness, something awakened. The largest Ork opened his eyes. Red glints flickered at the edges of his pupils. His breathing deepened. His muscles tensed. He pulled against his restraints, slow and steady. The metal links creaked. Rust flaked. The chain stretched. Not much, but enough to make the other Orks turn. He was remembering strength. A spark of instinct leapt from Ork to Ork. Not through words, not through sound, but through presence. The weakest of them straightened their backs. The strongest grinned behind muzzles of steel. The lumen strips flickered back on. The tech priests did not see what had changed. The overseers did not understand why heart rate monitors spiked. But deep beneath the scrape of boots and hum of machines, a new rhythm began. Faint, uneven, like a heartbeat trying to find its tempo. The Imperium believed silence would break them. Silence woke them. And the skin scrapers of sub-level 9, in all their merciless precision, had unknowingly carved a path toward rebirth. The labor pits were never silent for long. Machinery groaned, conveyor belts rattled, ore carts screeched along rust-choked rails, and the overseers' shock lances snapped with cold blue crackles whenever a prisoner stumbled. Yet none of those sounds meant anything to the Orks. They were the noise of slavery, not the thunder of war. The prisoners moved like ghosts, hollow-eyed, skin stripped raw from the scraping cycles, sinew trembling with fatigue. They hauled slag until their hands bled through the synthetic wrappings. Then they hauled more. Every step dragged, every breath scraped, every heartbeat was forced to continue by drugs and electrodes humming beneath their implanted restraints. The largest of them, once hulking, once unstoppable, no longer towered. His muscles had been carved down, his skin pale beneath the stains of filth. But something had changed. It started so small that even he did not feel it at first. A tightening in the forearm, a thicker pulse in the neck, a flicker of heat in the gut where sedatives once strangled life. The tech priests had cut away layers of fungal tissue, but orcs were never one body. They were layers of life stacked atop layers of instinct. Burning spores only made room for more to grow. He did not understand the biology. No orc did, but something deep and primal whispered, "Keep going." The overseers forced the prisoners into their shifts with mechanical efficiency. The tech priests stood on gantries overhead, logging heart rates and motor strength. They recorded the efficiency of scraped orcs, cataloguing how much labor they could survive before collapsing. Every day, new injections were rammed into thick necks. Every night, if night could be measured underground, the prisoners were chained in cages so small they could barely breathe. The facility did not rest. Neither did the orcs. But as the cycles dragged on, the labor pits transformed. Not physically. Every rusted machine, every blood-slick floor tile, every dangling chain remained exactly where it had always been. The change came first in the eyes. The smallest orcs, those who had been scraped nearly to death, began to glance at one another. Not long looks, not meaningful communication, just flickers. Moments where their vision focused on another green face, as if the instinct to recognize kin was stirring beneath layers of drugged haze. Then came the twitching. At first, the overseers thought it was the aftershock of sedatives. A muscle spasm here, a jerking arm there, but the twitching spread. Spasms synchronized. A dozen orcs, then 2 dozen, then half the pit would tense at the same exact moment, like marionettes pulled by one unseen wire. The Skitarii recorded the anomaly in their data systems, but the tech priests waved it away. Scatterfire of residual motor impulses, nothing more. Then the accidents began. An orc hauling a slag cart slipped, collapsing beneath the weight. The cart's momentum dragged it forward, chains rattling, wheels screeching until they struck a support pillar hard enough to crack stone. The shockwave trembled through the pit. Loose debris rained from the ceiling. Steam burst from a fractured conduit, hissing white fog through the air. Several prisoners fell to their knees as scalding vapor lashed their backs. The overseers descended immediately, firing shock lances into exposed flesh. 3 orcs died on the floor, bodies twitching as suppressed electricity fried their nervous systems. The largest prisoner watched from his chain post, his vision blurred but his instincts sharpened. Death was a thing he knew. Death was a thing he had dealt in with joy. But these deaths felt different, wasteful, wrong. Orcs were not supposed to die begging for breath in chains. They were meant to die charging, screaming, tearing worlds apart, with iron teeth and roaring engines. The next day, the productive output of the pit dropped below the projected efficiency level. The tech priests responded as they always did. Escalation. Injectable stimulants flooded the prisoners' veins. Electro-leashes shocked them into motion. Every orc moved faster, carrying ore and slag at a pace the human labor serfs above ground could never match. But the stimulants had side effects. For the first time in months, their hearts beat faster than the sedatives could numb. Their muscles warmed. Their breath burned. The largest prisoner felt something he had not felt since the battlefield. A spark of heat crawling beneath his skin, like a fire trying to push outward. He stumbled, dropped to a knee, and braced himself against the cold metal floor. He should have collapsed. He should have faded back into chemical fog. Instead, he clenched his hand. His fingers dug into the metal, hard enough that his nails, filed down by scraping cycles, left dents. The servitor monitoring his movement advanced, jabbing a shock rod into his spine. Pain lit through him, but instead of falling limp, he snarled. The sound was strangled by the muzzle, but his throat vibrated with low, furious thunder. His pulse spiked, his muscles bulged. The shackles at his wrists groaned. Something in the servitor hesitated. Machine spirits do not feel fear, but they calculate threat. And the threat from this prisoner had altered. Data streams flickered behind the servitor's milky eyes. Before it could act, a Skitarii ranger fired a neural dart into the orc's neck. The stimulant surge died. His limbs went heavy. He collapsed, shaking, breath choking in labored gasps. They dragged him away. Every prisoner watched. The tech priests hauled him to a reconditioning vat, a towering cylinder of murky green preservative fluid crackling with static energy. They submerged him to the neck, locking clamps around his chest and temples. Electrodes pierced his skull. The fluid burned his raw skin, stinging like acid. His vision swam in green haze. He drifted there for hours, maybe days, barely conscious, dreams flickering around him like broken scraps of memory. He saw war, not clearly, not as a story, as sensations, the roar of engines, the spark of gunfire, the stink of oil and fire, a war boss whose laugh broke mountains. He saw a blade in his hand, teeth clenched, battle joy rising like red sun. He woke with a roar in his heart, but not yet in his throat. They pulled him from the vat and forced him back to labor, expecting him to be weakened further. But the fluid had done something else. It had given his body nutrients. Strange preservative chemicals coursed through his muscles, their original purposes lost in centuries of incomprehensible manufacturum ritual. The tech priests believed the vats purified infection. They did not consider infection might be strength. He rose heavier, slower, but stronger. His arms trembled with new mass. His bones creaked with fresh density. The sedative still fought to drown his instincts, but something in him fought harder. The spark grew. He was not unique. Other orcs, smaller, frailer, began to change. One grew broader in the shoulders, another's wounds closed faster than before. A third shattered the handle of his ore cart in his hands. Every anomaly drew the overseer's eyes. Every show of strength was punished with shock glances, sedation, or confinement. Yet every punishment only slowed, never stopped, what was happening deep inside. On the 87th labor cycle after scraping, the machines malfunctioned again. Conveyor engines seized, grinding wheels jammed. Sparks rained from a generator as though a wounded dragon bled fire into the dark. Servo skulls dove shrieking through the air, their vox grills hissing alarm codes. Tech priests scrambled across gantries, issuing commands to servitors. The orcs stood still. Chains hung loose from their wrists. Ore carts sat idle on their tracks. No one moved. Even breathing slowed. The only sound was the crackle of damaged power lines. Then, from somewhere in the darkness of the pit, a noise broke the stillness. Not a word, not a roar, a single exhale, long and low, like the first breath before a storm. The largest orc heard it. Every prisoner heard it. Something ancient, something they had not known they remembered, stirred behind their eyes. They straightened, shoulders rose, backs squared. The overseers shouted commands, but their orders fell into dead air. One orc, a scrawny runt compared to the others, looked up at the ceiling. His eyes glimmered red. He clenched his fist, and for a heartbeat, he remembered what a fist was for. A Skitarii ranger fired a warning bolt. The tiny laser shot cracked through the air and struck the runt in the shoulder. Flesh seared. The orc jolted, stumbled, and then rose again. Rising was not allowed. But he did it anyway. The Skitarii fired again. The blast slammed the runt backward. He fell hard. But even dying, he kept his eyes open. They glowed with something like joy. If he could have spoken, he would have laughed. The largest prisoner watched the runt die. It was a small death, a meaningless death, a death with no noise. He felt his teeth grind against the muzzle. A memory flashed, blood spraying in the air, war cries echoing through rock, the roar of 50 orcs charging together as one unstoppable tide. It vanished just as quickly, but the echo lingered in his muscles. Something snapped, not a chain, not a bone, something inside. A pressure rose in his chest. A vibration crawled up his throat. His voice tore against metal barriers. He roared. It was muffled. It was broken. It was strangled. But it was a roar. It slammed through the labor pit like a shockwave. Every orc jerked at the sound. Hearts ignited. Muscles flexed. The overseers shouted in panic. Skitarii raised rifles. Servitors marched. But the roar would not stop. Even muffled, it was defiance. He pulled against his chains. The metal cut his skin, but he did not stop. He dug his feet into the floor, every muscle bulging. The shackles creaked, groaned, bent. A Skitarii sprinted across the catwalk. Neural rifle charged. But before he could fire, a servo skull plummeted from the ceiling, its machine spirit corrupted by static. It smashed into the ranger's helm, sending him tumbling from the gantry. He struck the floor below with a sound like splitting stone. The Orks stared at the fallen Skitarii. Blood leaked from the human's mask, and for the first time in countless cycles, the prisoners smelled it. Blood. Their hearts thumped in unison. A primal instinct, buried under sedatives and torture, clawed its way up. Orks did not think with the mind. They thought with the blood, with the bone, with the fight. Another roar tore free, this time from a different Ork, then another, then another. Dozens of choked battle cries shook the air, each louder than the last, each less muffled, each cracking the thin veneer of silence like glass. The largest prisoner yanked his arms forward with every ounce of strength. His shackles screamed. The bolt in the wall tore loose. A fragment of stone shattered. The chain did not break, but it shifted, just enough to move. He staggered forward, dragging metal links across the floor. A servitor lunged. He seized the machine by its rotten throat. Muscles bulged. Bone cracked, flesh tore. The servitor's eyes went dark, sparks spitting from its skull plate. Overseers panicked. Shock lances swung, electricity arced. Orks convulsed, but they did not fall. For every jolt of pain, they answered with a surge of rage. One ripped his muzzle loose, tearing flesh from his own gums. Blood poured over his chin. His first free breath was a growl. 2 more broke their restraints. 3 more followed. The pit descended into chaos. Servitors were crushed beneath green fists. Ore carts overturned. Steam pipes ruptured, coating the air in blinding vapor. Tech priests screamed machine curses, hammering emergency runes. Alarm klaxons shrieked. The Orks roared louder. The largest prisoner tore his muzzle loose with a final, devastating pull. Tusks snapped free of metal. Blood streaked his chest. He inhaled deeply. His first true breath tasted of iron, oil, blood, and freedom. He roared again. This time, the roar was full. It thundered against metal walls, vibrating conduits, shaking lights. Other Orks answered. Dozens of snarling voices rose as one. The roar was not just sound. It was identity. It was a birth. The Skitarii forces opened fire, red laser streaks cutting through fog. Orks fell. They did not scream. They only roared louder, defying death with laughter carved from madness. One leapt onto a ranger, ripping the rifle from his hands and beating him with the stock until bone cracked. The largest prisoner crashed into an overseer, snapping the human's spine beneath his weight. He seized the shock lance, ripped out the power cell, and rammed the broken shaft into a servitor's eye socket. Metal buckled, flesh tore, flames erupted. The labor pit became war, not organized, not strategic. Pure Ork war. Chaos fed them. Blood drove them. For the first time in months, their hearts raced fast enough to drown sedation. Muscles swelled with adrenaline. Bones knit faster, sealing wounds. Their skin darkened, not full green, but greener than yesterday. Their voices, once silent, filled the manufactorum with the music of violence. But the Imperium never underestimates its own power. From the upper levels, heavier Skitarii descended. Vanguard squads crackling with radiation-charged rifles. Cloaked figures moving in precise formation, a dominus at their head. Tech priests flooded control rooms with emergency override commands. Hydraulic gates slammed down, sealing corridors. Turrets unfolded from the ceiling, spitting hails of lead. The Orks charged anyway. Bullets tore into them. Limbs shattered, flesh ripped, but they kept moving. Every death fed the survivors, strengthening their resolve. Every fallen Ork left blood on the ground, and every drop of blood was a promise that war had returned. The largest prisoner roared and swung a shattered chain like a whip. It struck a vanguard in the helmet, caving metal inward. He grabbed another Skitari by the throat and hurled him into a column of copper wiring. Sparks exploded. The air filled with the stench of ozone, but numbers overwhelmed them. More tech guard poured in. Neural darts hissed through the air, burying into muscle and bone. The drugs surged again, dark, heavy, suffocating. The orcs staggered, knees buckled, breath thickened. One by one they fell. The largest prisoner fought sedatives longer than any of them. He bellowed, fists flying, blood spraying. He killed 3 more Skitari before the 4th dart struck his throat. His vision blurred. The room spun. He dropped to one knee. He ripped the dart out, but another struck his spine. Another pierced his shoulder. His roars turned to gasps. He dropped. The war ended as abruptly as it began. Tech priests swept the floor. Survivors were shackled with heavier restraints. Broken bodies were dragged away. Those still breathing were dosed with triple sedative cycles. The Dominus demanded deeper reconditioning. The Magos ordered full submersion lobotomization treatments. But beneath the chemical haze, something had been proven. The Orks could remember war. Even broken, even scraped, even half dead. They remembered. And the Imperium, for all its cruelty, could not stop memory from spreading. When the largest prisoner awoke again, he was back in his cage, chains tighter than before. His body throbbed with poisonous drugs. His head spun. His skin burned. But his heart beat strong. Stronger than yesterday. Stronger than ever. He lifted his head. The cell was silent. The prisoners around him lay motionless, sedated nearly to death. He exhaled one quiet sound. A rumble, a growl, a promise. And in cages nearby, eyes opened. Even in chains, even in ruins, the Orks were returning. Slowly. Inevitably. There were depths beneath the manufactorum that even the tech priests feared, though they would never admit it. Sublevels where old engines groaned with no clear purpose, where rusted cylinders pumped fluids no one could identify on any schematic, where Vox relays clicked and chirped with distorted whispers even when disconnected from the main network. Every inch of the facility was alive with the hum of ancient purpose, but some places trembled with a pulse too steady, too rhythmic, too deliberate to be coincidence. For years, the Magos and his disciples had dismissed such tremors as machine spirits muttering in their sleep. Now, after the uprising in the labor pit, no one slept easily. The Orks were chained again, reforged in restraints thick enough to hold armored ogrins. Their muzzles were welded shut, their cages bolted to the floor, their veins dripped sedatives strong enough to kill lesser creatures. The labor pit became a silent tomb. The prisoners' bodies twitched in drugged half-sleep, minds swimming through chemical fog. But not all of them succumbed. In the farthest cage, the largest prisoner lay motionless, chains buried into his raw flesh. His breathing was slow, heavy, but steady. Sedation blurred his vision. Pain cramped his muscles. But somewhere inside, a memory had taken root. A memory of the roar he had made. The roar the others had answered. It was small, distant, but it lived. Above, on the gantries, the tech priests whispered in machine tongue. Reports were compiled. Data streams logged. The Magos demanded answers. How had the suppression protocols failed? Why had the prisoners synchronized their aggression? Why had the scraping, the drugging, the reconditioning, the lobotomization cycles all failed to erase instinct? The lesser priests offered calculations, statistical outliers, biochemical redundancy in xenophysiology, unknown spore conditions. All explanations were unsatisfactory. The Magos needed certainty. Certainty meant control. And without control, the entire manufactorum risked contamination, sabotage, or worse, rebellion. The solution was extreme. The prisoners were transferred one by one into the disciplinary chambers, narrow hexagonal cells lined with vox grills. The tech priests believed isolation would sever the faint psychic links that stirred between them. Here, the Orks were kept alone, unable to see or touch one another. Machines measured every heartbeat, every twitch of muscle, every misfire of damaged neurons. Daily, servo skulls drifted through the hall, bathing each cell in waves of soporific radiation. Sedatives kept them docile, shock needles kept them weak. But the silence remained, and silence was never safe. 2 cycles after confinement, the first anomaly appeared. A junior engine seer reported faint vox static on an unused comm channel. When he tried to trace the source, the static abruptly ceased. A glitch, he thought. Nothing more. But that night, the static returned. Longer this time, rhythmic, pulsing, like a heartbeat translated into sound. He ran diagnostics. All systems were clean. The static persisted. Another engine seer heard the sound coming through a wall-mounted vox node. A low, gravelly hum, pitched too deep to be merely electrical interference. It reminded him, in a distant, sickening way, of something he had heard during the uprising, the Orks' muffled roars. He muted the channel, but muting did nothing. The whisper came back. The engine seers told the Magos. The Magos told them not to waste machine time with superstition. Machines do not whisper, he said. They malfunction. Malfunction means repair. Repair means restoration. And restoration is obedience. But the whispers did not stop. By the 6th cycle, Skitarii wardens reported auditory anomalies in their internal comm links, echoes of guttural breath, phantom vibrations that trembled beneath the surface of normal traffic. Some rangers began to hear voices when they patrolled the disciplinary chambers, muffled rumbles that seemed to seep through the silent air. Even though every Ork lay, chained and sedated, the Magos finally descended, to witness the phenomena himself. He walked the long corridor flanked by cells, cogwork legs clanking on iron grating. His sensors swept data. His lenses scanned for psychic irregularities. He expected to find nothing. Instead, he heard it, a faint, low hum, so deep that it seemed to vibrate inside bone rather than ear. It was not sound alone. It was pressure, a shift in the air, a vibration like a distant engine no one could see. The Magos stopped before the largest prisoner's cell. The Ork lay motionless, eyes half closed, chain-linked limbs slack against metal. Pumps hissed sedatives into his bloodstream. The tech priests had scraped his skin, pierced his skull, lobotomized his frontal lobe 3 times over. He should have been an empty husk, but his chest rose and fell with slow, deliberate breaths. The Magos placed a mechadendrite against the cell bars. His sensors tasted the air. There was no chemical source, no mechanical malfunction, yet the hum remained, rising and falling in a steady pulse. A heartbeat. Not just a heartbeat. A chant. So faint a human could mistake it for machinery groaning with age. The Magos ordered 2 Skitarii to open the cell. They stepped inside, rifles raised. The Ork did not move. His eyes remained half shut. His breathing did not change. The first Skitarii prodded his ribcage with a shock lance. Nothing. The second scanned his brain activity with a data probe. There was activity, not random. Misfires. Patterns. The tech priests stared at the data scrolls. The activity was synchronized with something nearby. Something they could not define. Something shared. Then the Ork's eyes opened, just a crack. But the pupils, once dull and grey, glimmered dark red. The Skitarii recoiled. The Magos ordered full voltage shock. A jolt of electricity surged through the Ork's nervous system. His body convulsed. His breath caught, but his eyes did not close. He stared straight ahead, unblinking, unmoving, as if pain were a distant inconvenience. The Magos increased the voltage. The Ork's back arched, chains rattled, his jaw clenched against the welded muzzle. blood trickled from his nostrils, but his eyes remained open, and the hum grew louder. Not from him, from every cell. One by one, prisoners began to breathe in slow, unified rhythm. Sedatives should have muted their pulses, but their hearts beat harder, pumping blood thick with spores the tech priests had sworn were destroyed. Their muscles tightened, their flesh darkened shade by shade. The whisper spread through the air, not words, not language. War. The magos commanded emergency sedation. Servitors rushed forward, plunging needles into exposed flesh. Green blood spurted. The chemicals flooded in. Heart rates should have plummeted. They did not. The prisoners twitched. Their chests rose faster. Their eyes opened. 100 red glimmers stared through steel bars. The whisper changed. It became a rhythm. 4 pulses, silence. 4 pulses, silence. A war chant with no voice. The tech priests realized too late what they had awakened. When cells isolate humans, they weaken them. When cells isolate orcs, they create pressure. Pressure is strength. Strength becomes hunger, and hunger becomes heat. The air in the corridor warmed, as if the orcs exhaled fire. Sweat beaded on the Skitaris' necks. The magos barked machine prayers, scrambling to activate suppression protocols. Doors slammed shut. Vox channels cut. Lumen strips snapped to full brightness, but the brightness revealed something worse. Every orc was awake. Every orc was staring. The magos staggered back. His mechadendrites flared. Data poured into his cortex faster than thought. Their brainwaves were synchronized. Their pulses synchronized. Their breathing synchronized. Not through communication, through instinct. Biological memory. War remembered itself. And war has no need of words. The whisper reached a crescendo. Metal sang in sympathy, vibrating along the walls, through the floor, into the chain-bound cages. The cell bars trembled, bolts rattling in their housings. The Skitari rushed to reinforce them, but the metal kept shaking, as if the manufactorum itself answered the chant. The magos screamed for silence. The orcs growled back. The hum broke into sound, not speech. A roar, low but unmistakable, rolled through the corridor. The Skitari fired. Beams of red light cut the dark. The orcs did not flinch. More roars joined the first, louder, harder. The metal bars shook. Bolts popped from their sockets. Muzzles cracked under flexing jaws. The prisoners heaved against their chains. One snapped. The sound, quiet as it was, echoed like a gunshot. Then another. Chains shattered. Restraints tore from walls. Cell doors buckled under brute strength. Tech priests screamed binary curses as the air filled with thunder. The largest prisoner rose first. He still bore wounds, still dripped sedative fluids, still staggered with weakness, but his muscles swelled like molten iron cooling into shape. Veins thickened. Tattoos beneath his pallid skin darkened green. He stepped forward, dragging the broken muzzle from his face. He exhaled, long and low, and smiled. Not a human smile, a predator's, a war smile. He slammed his fists against the bars. The entire cell shuddered. Metal bent inward. On the second blow, the frame cracked. On the third, the bars crumpled outward like thin tin. He stepped into the corridor. The Skitari fired again. Lasbolts seared his skin, leaving burning trails. He snarled and kept walking. A ranger charged forward, shot glance blazing. But the orc seized the weapon mid-strike and pulled the soldier into the steel bars, skull cracking like eggshell. His roar shook the corridor. The other cells burst open. Prisoners flooded the hall, wounded, naked, skin raw from scraping, but alive. More alive than they had been in months. They tore muzzles from their faces with bleeding fingers. They snapped their own restraints on rocks and walls. They flooded forward in a tidal surge of hatred. The tech priests fled. Skitari formed firing lines. The corridor lit with red fire. Orcs charged. Bodies collided in a frenzy of steel and flesh. The Skitari fought with precision, but orcs fought with inevitability. Broken bones healed mid-swing. Sedated muscles tore through iron. Every death fed a dozen more throats to roar. The vox grills overhead crackled to life, overloaded by the static of orcish rage. The hum became a screech, a primal shriek echoing through the manufactorum. Alarms wailed across every sublevel. Patrols mobilized. Bulkhead doors slammed shut. But shutting doors only makes cages smaller. The Orks tore a hole in the first blast door by ripping out its hinges. The second door they demolished with the body of a Skitarii alpha, still twitching from cybernetic shock. The third door was sealed by activation runes, but a single Ork, eyes glowing bright, smashed the rune panel with his head until the circuitry died and the hydraulics vented steam. They moved upward, into machinery-filled chambers shuddering from alarms and emergency lights. Servitors marched to intercept, but the Orks tore them apart piece by piece, ripping iron limbs from organic muscle. They hurled metal shells like crude weapons, smashing skulls and cracking armor. Still they climbed. Every corridor led them closer to the beating noise that had woken them. The whisper was loud now, loud enough to feel in their bones. Not a voice, not a command, but a call. Something ancient and brutal. Something that remembered war long before any of them were born. Perhaps it was only the echo of their own instincts. Perhaps it was a machine spirit, misfiring beneath miles of steel. Perhaps it was hallucination, born of too many drugs and too much rage. The Imperium would say it was madness. The Orks would say it was memory. The whisper became a roar, not from their throats, from the manufactorum itself. Engines shuddered awake. Chains snapped on ceilings. Cogs turned where no command had been given. Steam valves blasted open. The entire substructure trembled, as though the planet's core were laughing. Some tech priests believed it was machine spirits in revolt. Some Skitarii believed it was sabotage. A few, terrified, spoke words they never should have spoken. The prisoners are calling to something. They hear a voice in the metal. There is an intelligence here. Rumors spread faster than gunfire. Men whispered of psychic bleed-through. Women prayed to the God Emperor twice as often. Someone swore the Astronomicon dimmed a fraction, sending a ripple of dread across the galactic tide. It was all superstition, or maybe truth. The Orks did not care which. They smashed their way into a chamber of spinning turbines and hanging chains. Sparks rained from the ceiling. Tech priests shrieked binary terror as the green tide flooded in. The Orks tore open control panels with fists and teeth. They ripped machine components loose, using them as crude choppers. One seized a turbine blade larger than himself and hurled it across the room, bisecting a pair of Skitarii. And still they climbed. And still the whisper grew louder. The largest prisoner, bleeding from a dozen wounds, led the charge. His muscles had swollen to twice their former size. His skin darkened by the second. His eyes burned with sick red fire. He seized a broken pipe, spun it like a club, and crushed 3 humans with a single swing. Behind him, the other Orks roared and rampaged, their voices gaining strength until each cry shook dust from the ceiling. They no longer stumbled. They no longer trembled. They no longer remembered being slaves. They were Orks again, broken, scraped, drugged, half dead. Still Orks. No number of chains could silence that forever. The whisper had become a promise of war, a promise of blood, a promise of freedom. Whether it came from memory, instinct, machine, or the deep, brutal will of the universe, it no longer mattered. The Orks heard the call, and they would answer it. There is a truth buried beneath every battlefield the Imperium has ever claimed. Orks do not die the way other creatures die. They are seeded in war, born from violence, grown from the rot and ruin of slaughter. Their bodies are crude, ugly engines of muscle and fungus, built not just to survive but to return. A human bleeds out. A man dies in pain, a corpse rots, but an Ork's corpse is merely sleeping soil, waiting for blood and heat to wake it again. The Imperium knows this. That is why it burns their bodies, scrapes their skin, sterilizes their blood, and grinds their bones to powder. They believe that if they cut deep enough, there will be nothing left to grow. They are wrong. The manufactorum trembled under the weight of uprising. Doors had been torn from hinges. Ventilation ducts howled with escaping steam. Floors were slick with blood and oil. The air reeked of promethium fumes and burned flesh. Where servitors died, their machinery sparked and hissed, coughing smoke. Where Skitarii fell, their augmetics twitched in death throes. as if the machine spirits refused to accept defeat. Tech priests fled deeper into locked chambers, babbling Binharic prayers to soothe fevered machine minds. But no one could escape the sound. The roaring, pulsing, living sound. The prisoners were no longer prisoners. They had become the old thing again. The thing the Imperium tries to erase every time it encounters it. Green rage wrapped in meat and steel. They had lost their armor, lost their weapons, lost most of their skin, and still they fought. Their muscles were swollen grotesquely, their veins bulging black beneath scabbed wounds. Sparks of crimson light gleamed beneath their eyes. Feral, hungry, unmistakably alive. Something in the manufactorum felt it too. Engines that had been silent for millennia roared awake, as if the Orkish presence somehow coaxed machine spirits into anger. Conveyor belts reversed direction. Turbines spun without power. Lifts descended without command, disgorging servitor-laden platforms into the midst of the uprising. The entire facility had become a single vast battlefield, and the machines seemed eager to join the violence. The largest Ork led the charge, his body a monument of defiance. His skin, stripped raw a dozen times by the scraping bays, no longer looked pale or sickly. Shade by shade it deepened. Sickly grey gave way to bruised green. Bruised green darkened into living emerald. The very wounds that should have killed him pulsed with regenerative fungus, knitting tissue back together, knitting muscle thicker, knitting bone denser. Every drop of blood that fell to the metal floor spread in tiny filaments, like moss trying to take root, a reminder that Ork biology was never truly dead. The Imperium had believed the scraping erased their fungal resilience. The scraping had only made space for more to grow. One wounded Ork stumbled into a wall and slid down, gasping. He should have died. His chest was a cavity, ribs exposed. But as he lay there, his flesh quivered. Threads of fibre pulled taut. Green-black membranes spilled across shattered bone, forming a crude, pulsing patch. He snarled and pushed himself upright. His breath came in ragged, bubbling grunts. He looked at his hand, at the blood dripping from his fingers. Something flickered behind his eyes. Confusion, then recognition, then joy. He slammed his fist into the nearest Skitari so hard the corpse bent in half. The searchlights overhead flickered and failed. Shadows swallowed the chamber. Somewhere deep in the substructure, a generator screamed and blew apart, sending arcs of electricity crawling along the ceiling. The Skitari adjustments began instantly. New firing lines formed. Volleys of galvanic rifle fire ripped into the advancing Orks. Bolts tore flesh, burst organs, shattered joints. But the Orks did not fall. They stumbled. They grunted. They bled. And then they rose stronger. The Magos biologists watched from a sealed observation dais, eyes frantic behind layers of augmetic lenses. He stared at the screens displaying metabolic readouts, heart rate spikes, genetic activity. The numbers made no sense. Regeneration without spore seeding, muscle fiber replication with no catalyst, accelerated neural recovery even after lobotomization drills had ruptured whole pathways. The Orks were not supposed to come back, but the green never dies. The Magos called up archived texts on Ork physiology, ancient Mechanicus research from centuries of war. There were warnings, always the same. Orks grow stronger the more they fight. Their biology adapts to pressure. Their flesh remembers, but these prisoners had been broken. Their ecosystem had been sterilized. Their bodies stripped of every spore, every fungal cluster. There was nothing left to repair them, unless... His lenses zoomed on the largest Ork as it ripped a Skitari's arm from its socket and used it as a club. Something glistened under his skin. Not wounds, not scars, patches of dark green mold, living mold, spreading across his chest and arms, rooting in wounds, weaving muscle. The Magos froze. The mold was not native. It was new, grown from chemical residue in the vats, mutated by radiation leaks, thriving on the very sterilization treatments meant to destroy life. Orkish biology had eaten the poison and made it into strength. His voice cracked through the Vox channels, shrill with mechanical panic. Activate purification protocol, Delta 9. Vent the sublevel. Purge everything! The order raced through the command network. Bulkhead doors sealed. Alarm klaxons wailed. Gas vents hissed open across the ceiling. Clouds of white vapor billowed downward, cold and chemical thick. Purification gas, designed to break down organic matter on a molecular level. It would melt skin from bone. It would dissolve muscle. It would sterilize anything that breathed. The orcs smelled it coming. Some paused mid-charge, nostrils flaring. Others snarled and clawed at pipes and vents. The largest of them threw his head back and roared, a deep guttural sound filled not with fear, but fury. But the vapor poured down like a blizzard of poison. The first orcs to breathe it collapsed, flesh blistering, skin sloughing off like wax from a candle. They writhed and howled, choking on their own melting tongues. The others recoiled, but the gas spread fast, filling every corner of the chamber. Except something happened. Where the gas hit metal, it sizzled and vanished. Where it hit servitor bodies, it burned. Where it hit the largest orc's skin, it hissed, then stopped. His skin smoked. His flesh bubbled. And then his body rejected the poison. Thick patches of green fungus burst outward, creating a layer of armored tissue that drank in the chemical, absorbed it, neutralized it. The vapor washed over him and left him standing. Other orcs watched. Their bodies reacted. Gas melted them, and they healed. Not instantly, not fully, but faster than it should have been possible. Their own biology fought back, knitting burned flesh with fungal armor, sealing holes with living mold. Those without strength collapsed and died. Those with strength survived and became something else, something harder, meaner, unstoppable. The Magos saw it, and for the first time, he understood what was happening. The scraping cycles had not destroyed orc regenerative ability. They had forced it to evolve. He backed away from the console, trembling. His mechadendrites coiled inward like frightened serpents. He whispered, voice cracked with terror. They are becoming stronger than they were. Behind him, the door buckled. A fist the size of a cleaver slammed into the steel. Bolts popped. Sparks spat. The Magos screamed binary alerts. Skitari rushed to defend him, shields raised, rifles blazing. The door dented inward again. A third blow punched through, ripping metal into curled shards. The orcs burst in. Chaos swallowed the command dais. The Magos tried to flee, mechadendrites slashing. But the largest prisoner seized him by the torso, lifted him into the air, and slammed him to the floor hard enough to crack stone. The Magos spat static through his vox grill and clawed at the orc's face with surgical tools. The orc tore those tools from his limbs one by one, each rip spraying sparks and cyber fluid. The Magos screamed, high and metallic. The orc smashed his head until the scream stopped. The remaining tech priests ran, but the orcs had found something more precious than prey. They found control panels, buttons, levers, ritual, machinery. They did not understand them. They did not need to. They smashed them. They ripped wires from conduits, tore rune screens from walls, shattered cogitator banks with uprooted piping. Sparks flew in showers of orange lightning. Data streams died. Alarm systems failed. The manufactorum began to die. Without coordination, pressure levels spiked. Overloaded turbines spun out of control. Reactor coolant surged through cracked ducts. Floors trembled beneath seismic ripples. Somewhere in the deep, a reactor core whined like a wounded animal. The Skitari realized what was happening. If the prisoners continued, the entire subcomplex would detonate. They launched a counterattack. Dozens of them stormed the command dais, weapons blazing, precision targeting the largest orc. Lasfire struck him in the chest, shoulder, jaw, searing wounds into his flesh. He staggered, blood hissing from burning cuts. But the fungi beneath his skin reacted again, weaving shields from living tissue. The shots seared less deeply. His eyes burned brighter. He roared and leapt from the dais into the midst of the Skitari. His fists smashed helmets. His elbows shattered armor plating. He seized a ranger by the neck, lifted him overhead, and hurled him into a ventilation shaft so hard that metal bent around the corpse like clay. Behind him, more orcs rose to full height. They were no longer hunched, no longer trembling. Their skin had darkened almost completely now, green shining through blood and grime. Their tusks lengthened. Their muscles bulged. Some recovered speech, not words, just sounds, guttural barks, laughs, battle cries. The whisper in the walls did not stop. If anything, it grew louder. Machinery wailed like metal possessed. Vox channels stuttered with corrupted echoes, half-heard shouts, distorted war chants, static grinding into rhythm. The tech priests above ground began to hear it too. Workers in distant manufacturing wings claimed voices whispered from the ducts. Some said they heard chanting in languages no human recognized. Others swore they heard names, war bosses long dead, battles long finished, worlds long burned. The Imperium's logic frayed. Fear crept into rooms where fear was forbidden. And below, in the heart of sub-level 9, the Orks continued to grow. One of the prisoners, a runt hardly taller than a servitor, charged into a Skitarii sergeant and bit into his throat. Blood sprayed. The runt shrieked with savage delight. The wound in his belly, a deep spear of lasburn, healed mid-step. He grew taller, broader, his skin darkened. He threw back his head and howled. Another orc, missing half his arm from the scraping cycles, slammed his stump against a broken engine. Sparks burst. Heat surged. The stump bubbled and sprouted new tissue. Muscle extruded from bone, fingers sharpened into claws. He stared at his renewed hand, then laughed so loudly the ceiling shook. Every death, every wound, every drop of blood made them stronger. The largest prisoner stood in the center of it all, chest heaving, breath smoking in the cold air, fungus-webbed wounds pulsing with growth. He lifted his head. The whisper above deepened into something like a song, harsh, brutal, ancient. It was not sung by voices but by steel. Machinery trembled in time with it. He did not know the words. He did not need to. He roared in answer. The manufactorum answered back. Chains snapped from ceilings. Metal gratings buckled. Floodgates blew open, drowning Skitarii in scalding steam. Conveyor belts reversed, flinging servitors into shredding blades. Pressure valves burst, enveloping the room in a storm of sparks and flame. The entire sublevel was being torn apart by a machine spirit enraged by centuries of misuse. Or perhaps it was the Orks. Perhaps they had birthed something new, a barbaric intelligence, a fungal gestalt, a war spirit called up from the scraps of blood and metal. The tech priests would never know, because the Orks tore them apart. When the last Skitarii fell, when the final tech priest's scream was reduced to static in the Vox grill, the uprising stood victorious in the ruins of sub-level 9. Dozens of Orks remained alive, strong, growing, their bodies steaming with heat, their breaths heavy with anticipation, their wounds sealed, their muscles hardened, their eyes alight with hunger. The largest among them lifted a piece of metal, a broken gear shaft, and held it like a chopper. He turned to the others. They watched him. They knew him. Not as a leader by name, not as a war boss by title, by strength. He roared, not a word, just sound, and they roared back. For the first time since their capture, the echo was not hollow. It was powerful, shaking dust from the broken ceiling. The fungi in their veins answered. Their hearts roared harder. Their bodies shuddered with the savage joy of purpose returned. They needed guns, they needed metal, they needed engines. Somewhere above, this manufactorum still held all of those things. The uprising was not finished. It had just begun. There are places inside the Imperium's great industrial hearts where light has never fallen, where smoke and dust have settled into layered sediment older than any living worker, where engines rumble without purpose simply because they have forgotten how to stop. The manufactorum above sub-level 9 was one such labyrinth. Narrow corridors veined the steel like arteries. Great furnace chambers pulsed like diseased hearts. Cargo elevators clanked through the dark like funeral lifts. Every corner breathed heat, oil, and danger. Into that suffocating maze, the Orks climbed, not like prisoners crawling toward escape, but like predators hunting upward, pulled by a scent only they could smell, the smell of guns. The largest Ork sniffed the air and rumbled deep in his throat. He didn't know how to speak the word, but something in his muscles remembered it. Guns. Metal waiting to be turned into murder. The thought thrilled him. His blood thundered harder. The staircase that led up from sub-level 9 was built for servitors, not free beings. The steps were steep, slick with oil, half collapsed from centuries of rust. The Orks climbed them anyway, dragging their crude weapons, pipes, broken servitor limbs, jagged chunks of steel torn from turbines. Every footstep shook dust from the walls. Their bodies steamed in the cold air, fungal tissue radiating heat like engines fueled by violence alone. Behind them, Sub-level 9 screamed its last death rattle. One of the crippled reactors, starved of coolant after the Orks smashed its valve controls, overheated. The explosion was not a sudden roar, but a deep, agonized howl of ruptured metal. Shockwaves tore down the service tunnels. Fire swallowed the machinery. The entire floor bloomed in a horrific industrial blossom of blaze and smoke. It should have shaken the Orks from their feet. It did not. The explosion pushed them faster. Above, alarms screamed across every cogitator screen. Tech priests shrieked binharic warnings. Skitarii patrols mobilized, cybernetic feet hammering across iron walkways. Airlocks slammed to cut off the uprising, but iron doors are only barriers when the ones approaching are still, afraid. The Orks had no fear. They burst from the stairwell, into a pressure chamber where industrial loaders slept in their charging cradles like metal beasts. Servitors plugged into maintenance racks hissed in surprise, their decayed minds too slow to register the tidal wave of green charging toward them. A Skitarii squad formed a firing line, helmet lenses scanning heat signatures. Orders barked in clipped binary. Rifles rose. The Orks did not wait. The first shot tore into a prisoner's chest, blasting a hole clean through. The Ork staggered, bellowed, and flung himself harder at the shooters. He hit the line like a meteor, bowling rangers aside. Their armor crumpled under his fists. He grabbed two by the neck and smashed their heads together until their skulls cracked and augmetics sparked like dying stars. Another ranger jammed a shock lance into his spine and drove a current that would have killed a man instantly. The Ork roared, wheeled around, and bit through the ranger's forearm. Bone snapped like brittle stone. Blood jetted across the wall. The largest Ork shattered an industrial loader from its cradle and swung it like a club. Metal screeched. Sparks flew. Skitarii were flung through the air like broken dolls. One slammed into a cogitator bank hard enough to embed his armor in the wall. Another skidded across the floor, augmetic legs twitching as his nervous system fried. The squad broke. The survivors attempted retreat, sprinting toward a blast door. The Orks chased them, not because they had a plan, but because killing had purpose, and purpose was life. The first ranger reached the controls, but a thrown loader arm smashed him flat before he could seal the door. A second ranger tried to run past the controls and was caught by a chain the Orks had improvised from stripped electrical cable. They strangled him with it until wires snapped from his limbs. The blast door sealed too late. The Orks piled into the next corridor, roaring with the joy of violence. Their voices filled the manufactorum, ricocheting off metal walls, echoing upward into the hab levels where human workers huddled in terrified silence. Somewhere above, a priest of the Omnissiah chanted prayers into the vox, trying to steady panicked minds. His voice shook. There were legends, whispered in ancient Mechanicus archives, of manufactorums swallowed by Ork infestations, hives where green fungus grew on every conveyor belt, where every machine hissed with Orkish laughter. He prayed this was not the beginning of another. The Orks moved deeper. The corridor opened into a cavernous forge hall. Great furnaces loomed like burning mountains. Chains hung from the ceiling, thick enough to lift tanks. Catwalks crisscrossed in dizzying grids high above. McClamps held suspended girders ready for transport. It was a chamber made of metal, fire, and opportunity. If they lived long enough, the Orks would build weapons here. Real weapons, choppers with teeth and sparks, crude guns made from pipes, crank-fired cannons, maybe even scrap wagons, though none of them remembered what a wagon was yet. But instinct coiled deep in their bones. Metal meant killing. Killing meant strength. The Skitarii knew this too. Their second defense line waited here. Dozens of them. Vanguard squads with radiation rifles. Their cloaks rustling in machine-coded formation. Cataphren destroyers rolled into firing positions. Tracked bodies humming under the weight of plasma weaponry. Sicarian infiltrators crouched in darkness, claws crackling with electrostatic charge. Overseer priests stood behind them, chanting binharic litanies to steady the machine spirit, voices cold and trembling. The Skitarii opened fire. Radiation rifles spat clouds of invisible death. Flesh peeled. Veins blackened. Muscles jittered under necrotic decay. Plasma bolts burned holes through Ork torsos. Cataphren cannons sent bodies tumbling, limbs flying, fungal blood sizzling on the floor. And yet, the Orks ran faster. For every one that fell, two surged forward, wounds knitted even as flesh boiled. Bones thickened under impacts. The green beneath their skin shone like poisoned sunlight. A runt took a plasma bolt to the chest, flew backward, hit the floor twitching and got back up. His ribs poked through his skin. He shoved them back into place with a grunt, snarled, and charged again. The Skitarii could not believe what they were seeing. These Xenos had been scraped, sterilized, branded, chained, sedated. They should not have risen again. They should have been nothing but meat machines until they expired. Instead, they were evolving. The largest orc barreled into the first cataphron. The heavy servitor fired point-blank, plasma-blasting chunks of flesh from the orc's shoulder. The prisoner roared and grabbed the cannon barrel with both hands. Metal melted his palms down to the bone. He held on anyway. With a violent twist, he ripped the plasma gun from its mount, dragging half the cataphron's chest with it. Then he beat the machine corpse to scrap using its own weapon casing. The radiation rifles grew hotter, spewing invisible death into the green tide. Orcs stumbled, coughing blood, collapsing as their insides cooked. But even dying, they dragged themselves forward. One grabbed a Skitarii by the ankle and bit his armored foot until the metal cracked. The ranger screamed and stomped, crushing the orc's skull. But two more crashed into him, ripping him apart. The Mechanicus fought like precision-built killers. The orcs fought like storms made of bone. The battle was a massacre on both sides. For every orc that burst apart in a haze of sick vapor, 3 more smashed Skitarii heads against the forge floor. The chamber filled with smoke, fire, and the crack of metal giving way under brutal fists. An infiltrator dropped from the catwalk, twin blades charged with disruption fields. He dashed across the back ranks, slicing throats, carving tendons, severing spinal cords. Orcs fell at his feet, until the largest prisoner caught him mid-strike. The blade bit deep, cutting through muscle and bone. The orc grunted, seized the assassin by the face and crushed his skull as easily as snapping ceramic. The disruption field sputtered and died. With their assassins gone, the Skitarii line faltered, and the orcs pushed harder. One by one, the defenders broke formation. A vanguard tried to reload. An orc bisected him with a turbine blade. A tech priest attempted to ignite the floor traps. The largest orc ripped the detonator out of her hands and caved in her skull. The cataphron destroyers rolled backward, trying to create distance, but a dozen prisoners hurled themselves onto the tracks, biting, tearing, ripping augmetics free until sparks rained down and the war machines exploded. Within minutes, the forge hall was an abattoir of twisted metal and ruined bodies. The fires roared higher. Broken ammunition cooked off in erratic detonations. Vox grills rattled with panicked messages. Then something changed. The orcs stopped. Not because they were done fighting. They were never done fighting, but because a new sound cut through the smoke. A pounding, rhythmic, metal on metal. All the remaining prisoners turned to look. On the far side of the forge hall, a titanic shape stood behind ceramite blast doors. Something the Imperium had meant to keep sealed. Something built for war and not used in decades. The doors shuddered. Sparks jumped from locking cogitators. The pounding grew louder, deeper, angrier. Something inside wanted out. The orcs grinned. They advanced, slowly at first, then faster. They tore away control panels, smashed levers, ripped cabling from the walls. The blast doors whined, protested, bent inward. The thing behind them rammed again, flattening steel. Bolts flew like bullets. With a final shriek of tortured metal, the doors burst open. From within stepped a tracked monstrosity of steel and rivets, red-painted plating flaked with rust, turret hanging loose from disuse. It was a tank loader, designed to haul armoured hulls from one assembly line to another. But to orcs, it looked like something else. A machine that could be made into war. A half-dead servitor clung to the command node. Its brain long since rotted into autopilot. The machine turned its gunless turret toward the orcs as if asking wordlessly, "What do you want?" The largest orc stepped forward. He touched the hull. The metal was cold at first. Then, under his hand, it grew warm. Fungal residue from his skin spread onto the plating. It was faint, harmless, barely visible. But the machine shuddered. The engines coughed. The tracks jerked. Something ancient stirred inside the machine spirit. An echo. The loader belonged to the Imperium, but now the orcs claimed it. The servitor moaned, then died, its augmetic head splitting under sudden pressure. The machine turned toward the rest of the forge. The largest orc climbed onto the hull, found a place where his fists could hold tight, and bellowed. The other orcs roared in answer. The machine lurched forward, through the forge hall, through crumbling corridors, through half-collapsed transport tunnels, they rode. Every meter closer to the surface meant cleaner air, less steam, more space to kill. Alarm klaxons screamed overhead. Servitors swarmed from maintenance hatches, but the makeshift war machine crushed them without slowing. The orcs clung to it like parasites returning to their old host. Sparks flew from grinding tracks. Pipes burst beneath its weight. Steel screeched as if the manufactorum itself begged mercy. There was none. At last, they reached a cargo elevator big enough to lift tanks. The loader rolled onto its platform. The orcs piled around it, snarling and pacing like a pack eager for blood. The largest prisoner smashed the lift control. Sparks spat. Gears engaged. The platform groaned upward. They ascended. Floor by floor, through crumbling sublevels and flooded maintenance bays, through storage corridors dripping with coolant, through rust-eaten reinforcement columns. With every meter, the orcs grew stronger. Their fungal flesh thrived on rage, heat, and blood. Spores drifted from their wounds, seeding the air, clinging to walls, growing microscopic roots into every crack. In a week, this place would sprout green. If the Imperium still lived to see it. When the platform slammed into its uppermost lock, the doors opened onto a manufactorum hall bathed in emergency lighting and panicked motion. Workers fled. Server rigs clattered. Tech priests screamed into Vox relays, begging for reinforcements. None came fast enough. The tank loader surged forward, smashing through assembly lines. Orcs leapt from its chassis, tearing through guards, rending bodies, ripping open crates of ammunition and raw metal. One prisoner grabbed a length of jagged pipe and swung it in wide circles, laughing with giddy, violent joy. Another tore open a crate of unassembled autogun parts, sniffed them, and began smashing metal pieces together until they resembled a crude firearm. It wouldn't fire. It didn't matter. It felt right in his hands. Then they saw it. Rows of heavy machine components, power coils, hydraulic rams, cogwork teeth taller than a man, uncut plating waiting to be forged into tank armor. For a heartbeat, the orcs froze. This was potential. This was memory. This was war, waiting to be born. The largest orc roared, pointing with a fist bigger than a helmet. The others surged toward the machinery, tearing pieces free, smashing bolts, ripping apart housings for anything they could use. Some hammered metal on metal, sparks flying. Others found cutting torches and held them like flamers, scorching walls, laughing as flames curled along conveyor belts. It wasn't weapon crafting, not yet. It was instinct gathering shape. The workers who tried to resist were butchered in seconds. Those who fled lived a little longer, sprinting down catwalks and staircases, their terrified footsteps echoing through the halls. But there was one place left the orcs had not reached. The surface. A massive transit gate loomed at the far end of the hall, a colossal steel iris built to move finished war machines out into the world. It was sealed, reinforced, guarded by thick walls and heavy gun emplacements. The orcs headed straight for it. Skitarii reinforcements arrived just as the loader rammed the first barricade. Shock troops with phosphor blasters fired from elevated platforms. Incendiary shots burst, coating orcs in burning chemicals. Flesh melted, fungus sizzled. Prisoners howled as fire chewed through muscle. But still they advanced. A handful died. More took their place. The Skitarii switched to armor-piercing rounds. The shells punched holes through green torsos, shattered spines, blew heads apart. The orcs shook from the impacts, then their wounds closed. Not cleanly, not perfectly. Tissue bubbled. Bones sprouted new ribbing, skins sealed with grotesque patches of mossy armor. Vents in their flesh hissed green vapor. They were mutating as fast as they were killing. An alpha warden shrieked for heavier weapons. Too late. The loader hit the barricade with a scream of torn metal. The impact hurled defenders from catwalks. The gate wall shook. The orcs poured in behind the machine. They smashed gun nests. They pulled Skitarii from firing positions and dashed them against adamantium plating. One grabbed a phosphor blaster and fired it wildly until its battery overheated and exploded in his hands. They reached the transit gate the Imperium had built, it too strong to break from outside. The Orks only smiled. Wider, they set to work. They tore away security panels. They ripped out conduits. They smashed cogitators, pried open power nodes, dented hydraulic cylinders with their fists. Electricity arced across their skin, blood sizzled. They ignored all of it. The largest Ork climbed the main support strut and smashed his fists into the locking bars. Metal groaned. Rivets shot across the room like bullets. Sparks blinded him. His knuckles peeled to bone. He hit harder. Each strike warped the irising plates. Each roar shook dust from the ceiling. The gate's machine spirit shrieked through every Vox grill, a metallic wail of defiance. Then, something snapped, a sound like a titan's spine breaking. The gate coughed smoke. Its hinges buckled. The entire iris shuddered, twisted, and tore open. Cold night air rushed in, carrying dust, ash, and the distant thunder of artillery. Above, the sky was black, starless, lit only by distant fires and the pulsing glow of manufactorum towers. Freedom was inches away. But freedom meant nothing without war. The Orks smelled the open world and roared. The loader rolled forward, carrying them into the night. Other prisoners sprinted beside it, bloody footprints smoking on the cracked pavement. The manufactorum behind them blazed with chaos. Lights flickered across the city. Sirens wailed. Anti-air batteries pivoted toward the breach. Patrols formed. The Imperium was waking up to what had escaped its cages. But they were too late. The Orks were loose, and no one, not tech priest, not Skitari, not soldier, could put chains back on creatures who had remembered what they were. The breaking of chains was only the beginning. Night over the manufactorum was a wound in the sky, thick with ash and industrial smog, lit only by the sickly glow of reactor stacks and the distant pulse of searchlights. No stars shone, no moon, only fire. The ground trembled as the tank loader thundered across cracked ferrocrete, its tracks spitting sparks, its battered chassis growling like something alive and hungry. The Orks swarmed around it in a surging tide of green muscle and fungal rage, every breath steaming in the cold night air, every roar vibrating with a violent joy that felt like worship. They had escaped, but Orks did not escape. Orks invaded. The manufactorum guards were the first to face them. Men and women with laser guns and shock batons, armor made for discipline rather than war, eyes wide with terror. They formed a trembling line across the courtyard, shouting orders, trying to steady each other with hollow courage. Somewhere in the ranks, a Vox officer screamed for reinforcements. Too many Xenos, too fast, too strong. The words dissolved into static. The Orks did not slow. The loader slammed into the defensive line like a blunt instrument of extinction. Bodies flew. Armor cracked. The guards who survived tried to retreat in orderly steps, but retreat is impossible when fear is louder than orders. The line broke into splintered fragments of fleeing humanity, scattering into the alleys between warehouses and transport bays. The Orks chased them without hesitation, pounding footsteps shaking the ground, claws ripping through flesh and ceramite. The largest Ork leapt from the loader, landing with a crunch that cracked the ferrocrete beneath him. He seized the nearest guard and crushed his helm like wet clay, bones snapping under the green thunder of his fist. Another guard fired a lasbolt into his chest. The shot burned a fist-sized hole, smoke curling from exposed bone. He looked down at the wound with mild curiosity, sniffed, and roared as it sealed shut beneath a surge of fungus and blood. The guard ran. The Ork chased. Screams filled the courtyard. Vox beacons flickered. Floodlights snapped to life, bathing the scene in harsh yellow glare. The Orks howled at the sudden brightness, not in fear but excitement. Light meant they could see. See meant they could kill. A squad of Militarum auxiliaries rushed from the north transit arch, flak armor glinting, bayoneted rifles aimed at the mass of green shapes. Their sergeant shouted, voice cracking as he commanded fire. The volley hissed across the courtyard. Lass rounds sliced through Ork flesh, cauterizing holes that should have dropped them. Instead, the Orks staggered and kept coming. A few fell. Many rose again. The soldiers fired harder. Pulse after pulse hammered into the tide. But Orks did not retreat under fire. They ran faster. The loader smashed into the firing line. The impact was not a battle. It was a disaster. Bodies shattered under its tracks. Soldiers thrown aside broke like dolls. The survivors tried to regroup, calling for armor support, artillery support, anything support. But their pleas were drowned beneath the thunder of green fists, roaring engines, tearing metal. The manufacturing walls shook. Sirens echoed across the entire district. Great voxcasters mounted on spires began blaring evacuation orders. Civilians poured from hab blocks in panicked rivers of humanity, running barefoot, clutching children, dragging wounded family behind them. Many believed this was a reactor breach. Some suspected chaos, none imagined the truth, because the truth was too humiliating to comprehend. Orks, unarmed and naked hours ago, now rampaged through the heart of Imperial industry. The Imperium had never broken them. They had only made them hungry. The Orks reached the first transport yard, where heavy lifters waited in serried ranks, their engines dormant, their hulls bearing the sacred sigils of the Omnissiah. The largest Ork turned toward the nearest one and swung his fist into the side of the hull. Metal buckled. The machine trembled. Sparks burst from ruptured conduits. The lifter growled awake with a coughing roar, machine spirit enraged by the violation. The Orks cheered. They struck it again and again until the metal bowed inward and a door tore loose. They climbed inside, sniffing engines and controls, slamming fists against panels with childlike curiosity. Something deep in their instincts recognized the potential. Machines meant movement. Movement meant war. On the other side of the yard, Skitarii vanguard formations deployed in disciplined ranks, their precision drills cutting through panic. Rad carbines glowed with lethal power. Servo skulls darted overhead, marking targets. Tech priests chanted rapid Binharic prayers, their mechadendrites swirling with surgical grace. This time, the Imperium fought without hesitation. They had seen enough to understand. If the Orks reached the surface roads, the city would fall. If they reached the foundries, the Orks would build. If they built, nothing would ever stop them again. A new firing line formed. Target locks chirped. The battlefield shimmered with rad heat. The Orks charged. The rad volley hit like an invisible storm. Flesh cracked, eyes bled. Tumors blossomed instantly beneath green skin, swelling into grotesque lumps. One Ork's jaw melted off his face. Another's ribs collapsed into tar. A third burst into a cloud of steaming gore. The survivors roared not in pain but fury. Wounds sealed. Fungus devoured tumors. Corruption became fuel. The rad sickness did not kill fast enough. It only made them stranger. The Skitarii closed ranks. Their augmetic limbs braced for impact. The impact came. The loader rammed a cataphoron at full speed, tearing the tracked cyborg in half. The Orks hurled themselves into the firing line, wrenching rifles from bionic hands, beating metal and flesh into ruin. A tech priest tried to retreat, binary praise screeching through his vox grill, and was torn apart by three Orks fighting over which one got to kill him first. A Sicarian leapt from concealment, blades flashing, carving fungal flesh from green bone. The Ork he cut didn't fall. He bit the assassin's throat out and kept fighting with a piece of bionic blade stuck in his shoulder. The Skitarii formation collapsed. Panic spread. Some scattered. Some fought to the last. All died. The Manufactorum's outer gate loomed ahead, a towering slab of ceramite and adamantium, reinforced with purity seals and layered blast shutters. It guarded the road into the city proper, where Imperial Guard barracks, Chimera depots and armoured columns waited. If the Orks pushed through, there would be war in the streets, war in the plazas, war in the hab blocks, a war the Imperium never expected to fight inside its own walls. The gate began to close. Hydraulics screamed. Metal groaned. The mechanism was built to withstand artillery. The Orks hit it anyway, first with fists, then with metal beams dragged from ruined lifters, then with the loader, rammed at full speed, smashing into the gate with a detonation of sparks and torn steel. The impact dented the plating, but not enough. The loader backed up, engine howling through tortured machinery, fungus spreading across the hull like mold claiming rotten meat. The Orks pushed with their hands, their backs, their shoulders. The gate bent inward a fraction more. Not enough. They roared. The air changed. Something ancient and stupid and terrifying woke inside them, a collective hunger, a psychic echo of violence so primal it had no language, only pressure. It was not a plan. It was not a strategy. It was a need. Their bodies burst with strength not drawn from biology, but from rage. Their muscles swelled. Their bones cracked and reforged. Teeth lengthened. Claws grew. The fungus in their blood pulsed like a second heart. They hit the gate again. This time, the metal screamed. A crack ran along the hinge like lightning through stone. The gate buckled. The loader smashed into it once more, and the hinge tore free, bolts snapping and clattering across the ground. The gate collapsed, and beyond it, the city waited.